Is a crash coming? Well, take a look. It's actually already here, says our guest. In many ways, it's here. So today we are going to explore some basics in the further effort to prepare us all in ways in which we can start now to secure ourselves or to brace ourselves to survive it. We've been so distracted by the high wire acts in this bizarre circus of American politics the past few years. We've paid little or no attention to the huge elephant in the ring. A massive economic crash is coming, and in many ways, it's already here. Financial research expert and former banker Charles Ortel, you know him in a very different capacity, but exercising the same close scrutiny of a whole other system. But Charles Ortel, who proved that several major U.S. corporations were overvaluing their Wall Street traded stocks around the time of the 2008-2009 crash, says there's little doubt a serious economic downturn is close. The financial investigators' research into the Clinton Foundation, reported in great detail and still continuing right here on Lead Stories, has unearthed fraud so massive at that foundation, he calls it the largest unprosecuted charity fraud in U.S. history. And that same meticulousness is being brought to this program today in reporting what he sees on the horizon. Now, who is Charles Ortel? Again, we know him here on Lead Stories as specifically concerned with the Clinton Foundation, and it is ongoing. I encourage you to visit the website charlesortel, ORTEL.com, where all of the documents, the supporting documents, are online. You can see them for yourself. And this story, which we have been following for quite some time now, about the Clinton Foundation continues. His research continues, and it continues to be alarming. The extent of the criminality of this foundation. Charles Ortel is a former Wall Street banker, having been a managing director at Dillon Read and Newport Value Partners, and a private financial investor. In 2007, he became a whistleblower and was instrumental in bringing down General Electric after revealing that GE was fraudulently overvaluing its stock by billions and billions of dollars to mislead its investors. For the past 2+ years, as I've said, he's been concentrating on reviewing the financial records and collaborations and networks of the Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Clinton Foundation. His analysis investigated the foundation's fundraising practices, its allies and associates, its so-called charitable interests, and its political and corporate connections, both in Washington and overseas. He's a Yalie, where he got his undergraduate degree, a master's from Harvard Business School, and we are lucky to have him with us today to begin this journey. We'll do this in a series of programs, to begin this journey to help us understand what's coming and how best to prepare for it. Charles, great to have you with us. I'm so delighted that you could squeeze us in.
No, Idris, it's always a pleasure to come on your show. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Let's start with the whole idea of this crash coming. What makes you say that?
All right. Well, actually, when you think about financial markets and you think about stocks and bonds, they can seem enormously complicated to people who have little familiarity with them. But it's simple math, very simple math, arithmetic. Allows people like me who understand the accounting rules and understand what the financial statements say to tell you whether a given security, a stock or a bond is overvalued or undervalued. And that's because you can do a straightforward mathematical exercise and you can say, under reasonable assumptions, what should this bond trade? What price should the bond trade? And under reasonable assumptions, what price should this given basket of common stock trade? You could price any security. And then you can go and you can say, well, I've done my work. It's based on my assumptions. What is the market telling me about whether the bond is overvalued or undervalued, whether the stock is overvalued or undervalued? The underpinning for most of this work is the bench is what's called the benchmark risk-free rate, and we have a lot of data on what that interest rate historically has been. The long boom bust, and then maybe artificial boom from 1963 or so, right the way up until 2007 or 8. That risk-free rate has averaged, let's say, 7% or so. Currently, it's 2%. And when central banks can get together and they can, through their machinations, they can manipulate interest rates, and governments can manipulate this risk-free rate up or down as they see fit. And I would argue that that's exactly what the U.S. government began doing late in 2008 in response to the dread effects of the last major crisis that we had. They looked at the cards that they held, and the strongest card that they held, that is to say our Federal Reserve and the big central banks around the world, was to push the interest rates down on the floor. And by doing that, when you push interest rates down, you artificially elevate the prices of all securities, stocks and bonds. And so that was one move that they made. The other move that they made, led by our own government, was to engage in a massive binge borrowing and spending spree that, in theory, was supposed to jumpstart the economy. Now, this began to have effect in 2009. That's a long time ago. And what
As a matter of fact, today we learned that Donald Trump is seeking yet another rise in the threshold of debt.
Right. Well, we have to. I mean, now the level of debt. What I tried to do when I embarked on this journey, and I actually have been studying this since about, I would say, 2002 or so. I didn't think, well, when I took that time off I mentioned to be with my family and in quotes retired back in 2002, I was deeply troubled by the evidence that I saw. You know, I saw lots of experts saying, you know, things were not working correctly and proposing all kinds of theories that seemed to only compound the problems. I wasn't comfortable that the existing theories explained the course of economic progress in this country. So I spent a lot of time thinking about it, educating myself. And indeed, you know, when you ask somebody, is the economy going well or poorly, most people start with their own experience. They look at their own house or apartment. They look at their own borrowings, if they have borrowings. They look at their own savings, if they have any savings. They look at whether their job is secure or not, whether they're fearfully going to be fired, and if they are fired, can they find another job? They look at their expenses. You know, are their basic expenses, not their luxuries, are they going up or down? And that's where I start thinking about it. I mean, the simplest statistic that you bring up debt, it's a great point. The simplest statistic that I think helps you figure out whether an economy is in good shape or bad shape, and therefore whether its citizens are likely to be in good or bad shape, is the ratio of total debt on an economy. And that's a figure that is, you know, tough to argue with. The federal government and the Federal Reserve put out pretty precise estimates of how much total debt sits on this economy. And it's a very large number now. If you exclude the required payments in future times for Social Security stuff, I'm talking about hard debt, borrowings that have to be repaid, and if they're not repaid, people suffer, is now many, many times the total amount of wages and proprietors' income that all Americans earn in a given year. We're all, as a country, very highly leveraged. And that situation is compounded by the fact that, in the main, rich people don't borrow that much. So when you look at the ratio for the country and you say the total debt is whatever it is, I'll use round numbers because I don't have figures in front of me, but let's say the total debt is on the order of $55 trillion. Let's just use that number. Well, the total stock of income from the private sector, now excluding government income, but from the private sector and self-employed people in a given year is more like, let's call it $8 trillion. Now, it's not like you can use that $8 trillion to pay off the debt. And people have to pay rent or pay for a house. They have to feed themselves. They have to pay for increasingly more expensive health care. And when you subtract the running costs from their income and the taxes from their income, there's precious little amount left inside the richest country in the world, this country, to service this gigantic debt. And you can look at these figures. It's like, I don't know how many of your listeners like to ski, but that happens to be one of the things I like to do. And, when you look at the course of interest rates from 1981 to the present, it looks like an expert downhill ski slope. I mean, it's a straight down this entire period. And you can't run an economy effectively with negative interest rates. It's not like we're going to go, from wherever we are today on the risk-free rate I'm talking about is the interest rate on 10-year debt issued by the U.S. government, the federal government. And that interest rate now is about 2.25. If you were to double that to 4.50, the stock market would go down by minimum 30%, possibly more than that. And 4.50 is still a level that is well under the historical long-term average risk-free rate level. So it's not like it's a punitive rate. In the worst times, in 1981, the long-term interest rate was, the 10-year interest rate, that's to say, was more like 12%, 14%, as opposed to 2%. And so that's one threat. The second threat is when you go back to the good old days, the halcyon days of 1981, when the economy was struggling everywhere, there was one very important difference in 1981 to 2017, and that was the age structure of our population. So back in 1981, the senior proportion of the population, people 55 and up, as a percentage of the total, wasn't that high. And the most economically active people aged 25 to 54, that pocket of people, because of the course of history, was slated to increase dramatically from starting in 1981-82. Excuse me, and it did so from 1982 right the way through till about 1999. So you had a large number of economically active people going through the most cash flow positive years of their lives, where they would buy homes and second homes and remodel them, and if they had spare cash, invest. So there was a tremendous amount of vigor inside our economy, caused basically by decisions made decades before then about whether and how many to have children. So that's a condition we don't have today. Today we have that proportion of the population, unless we start admitting a lot of people aged 25 to 54 as immigrants, it's not going to grow, and the senior population is going to soar, and people are not having as many children. So that's a very, very different set of circumstances in 2017 than it was back in 1981 and in the roaring period through 1999. Another thing that happened in that period is that, we could debate why, But there's no question that for the period 89 to 2001, the U.S. was the unipolar force in global politics. I mean, communism blew up many places. States that were leaning socialist or communist began to embrace capitalism and more market-based economies. So gigantic export markets opened up for our products. And in addition, these rising economies began to knock off our expensive products and produce cheaper versions of them, which we imported into this country. So there was a very unusual period. And I argue, and I have argued in the past, I think America squandered an amazing set of cards that we held in that time frame under a Republican and then under a Democratic president. Then we got hit hard by what happened, and I'm obviously skipping over many things, but we got hit hard by the events of September 11th, 2001, and the aftermath that we're still coping with around the world. So it's not like we have, the world at peace in America in the top post of the world. Then you get into this whole issue of machines and technology replacing human labor. We're having this discussion. I'm sitting in an atrium near Grand Central Station on my cell phone talking to your audience. I mean, it wasn't that easy you couldn't have done this in 1981. And who knows what it'll be like in 5 years. What machines will do to basically work people humans out of jobs. So all of us, I would argue the richer you are, the more money you make from a job, the more vulnerable you are to being replaced by a machine in one way or another. So there's a large set of unusually negative forces at work here. And I'm starting on, I don't think I have many more to tell you that are negative. But on the other hand, this nation of only 325 million people out of, call it 7.5 billion, is in a far better state than virtually any other significantly, large number of people nation. So when we go through the crash, which I think is in place, when you think about it, I mean, pre-2001 or pre-1999, if you were in a business-related job, you could actually walk out the front door of your office on Friday and not check the computer all weekend. When you went home during the week, you made a decision to leave the office. You didn't have to, again, have a quick meal and then go stay online and answer emails all night. So it's very debatable when we look at these income levels that, are not rising as fast as they should. It's really debatable when you consider how many hours you have to spend to keep your job, whether your wages are actually going up in nominal terms for the same job. I would argue that they've dropped in nominal terms, that is to say, unadjusted for inflation. And then when you consider inflation, seriously, not at a superficial level, when you say, what does inflation really mean? I mean, do certain types of people have costs they bear that will rise at a different rate than other types of people? And, one I would argue, which is very controversial, is this one. When you go and you look, you say, all right, the key to making more money in life is to getting a good education. I was very fortunate that my parents were themselves educated and encouraged me and my brothers to actually go to school, care what the teachers had to say, and try to do really well in school. And that's something that I love doing, enjoy doing, and I had the great benefit, as you mentioned, of going to two reasonably good universities. When you look at the cost of those universities versus, the sticker cost times 4, if it's a 4-year school, and compare that figure to how much you can earn coming out with just a 4-year degree, a bachelor's degree. Back in the day, I got out of Yale in 1978 and Harvard in 1980. The costs, they weren't cheap, but from rough memory, I was able to very quickly pay off my student loans and to live comfortably. How do you do that? How do you do that today, paying whatever it is? If you're not eligible for financial aid and you don't get a scholarship, how do you pay off as that student? And I know some who have, leave these schools with $200,000 in debt, can't be discharged in bankruptcy. And the prices of these universities, because what we've done is we've opened them up to the world, there's a massive demand for very few spots at these universities. And, of course, loyal alumni are willing to give these universities large sums of money for various reasons. So they've jacked up the cost of education at these premier schools far faster than the rates of published rates of inflation. So, to sort this all out, I go to the basic type of kitchen table thinking that really I should animate most people who think about their money. And it's very simple. Whenever you choose to begin your week, I like to start Sunday night thinking about the coming week, but whenever you choose to start thinking about your week, get serious about thinking about your week once a week and ask yourself what you want to accomplish in a week and what you would consider to be success at the end of your week. And a simple way I think of to measure success is, at the end of each week, do you have any money left over? Did you spend less money than you made in that week? Most people will say no, they didn't. Borrow their credit cards or they, one way or another. And every week that you spend more than you earn is a week that you're getting in more and more financial trouble. But we're not taught to think like that. We're encouraged. You look at all these, you watch television anymore. You look at these ridiculous ads. You could go, put no money down, or you could get a check by entering into an agreement to take possession of a car, put no money down for a house. You're encouraged, I would argue, by many people in authority to behave irresponsibly, to borrow more money than you can ever hope to repay at a time when our nation is teetering to tremendous amounts of debt. So the first place to start is to take an honest inventory of yourself. Ask yourself, do you have any debt? And get a plan as quickly as possible, pay off your debt.
We'll get to some more specifics in a minute. What I wanted to just go back to was, in your explanation, you actually are saying that one of the ways in which we have to evolve is to get to understand the relationship between I, the individual, and Wall Street and stocks and bonds. How do I measure where the country is going? What are some of the indices that I should pay attention to get a sense of, well, are we stable as a country? Are we, in graver danger than we know? How do we use the guideposts that you do? I mean, not to the extent that you should be as professional as you are, but what are some of the benchmarks that you look at in order to get a sense of where the economy is and how it's likely to affect me?
Okay, that's a great question, Patrice. I'll try to answer it. The best survey performed by our government is called the Consumer Expenditure Survey, and I believe it's done by, I think, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You can find this online. And they publish a very detailed, they even they explain, as government officials like to get into details, but they explain in considerable detail how they do it. They're all kind. If you really get interested, you can read many pages about the origins of the survey and how it's evolved over time. Cutting through all that, the figures for 2004 to the most recent period, which I think is 2015, are enormously thorough and quite informative. So what they do is they present a snapshot of the entire U.S. economy, and they then subdivide it various ways. They subdivide it. One way is to put it into what are called quintiles, so groups of 20%. And they even have further breakdowns of the top 10%, the next 10%, and then so you can look, and they tell you, all right, how many households are in each quintile? in those households, how many people are earning money, how much money do they earn pre-tax and post-tax, from what sources, is it wage income, is it interest, is it dividends? And then what's really informative is they take you through how each bucket of households spends their money. And they give you an estimate of how much does the families, in great detail, for example, how much does a family spend on eggs? How much do they spend on, men's clothing? How much do they spend on this and that and the other thing? And you can really get some very precise information, surprising information about, how all people in America do. And several things just leap off the page to me. When you look at the biggest, the highest earners, the first thing that's different about the highest earning households is that on average, in most recent data, 2.1 people in the household are in the workforce, meaning that it's, husband, wife, or, partners, and maybe a child or a parent or somebody else are earning money. Very quickly, as you go down, not all the way to the bottom, you discover that there are many, many households that have less than one person in them earning money. Okay. Then when you look, 20% of all households, well, let's say there are 120 million households. So you're talking about 24 million households in the top 20%. That's a lot of people. And in that people, it's Warren Buffett, it's Bill Gates, it's the very rich people, it's all the sports stars and, entertainment figures. Yet the average total wage income in the most recent figures for the top 20% is $200,000 or so. Yeah, I think slightly less than $200,000 across 24 million households. I had expected that number to be a lot higher than it is. And then when you go and you say, all right, that gives me a sense of how the richest households are doing. Let's take a look at how all households have been doing over time. And you could do that, as I say, consistently going back to 2004. What you see is that all of us from 2007, 8 forward, all of us are worse off than we were prior to the time that the government began suppressing interest rates and spending recklessly with no controls. We're all worse off. All Americans, Republicans, Democrats, progressives, conservatives. The figures show that everybody, the large mass of Americans is all worse off economically. Now, who wants to see that? I mean, nobody can be in favor of that. But that's what the data shows. And you can actually, if you keep track of your own expenses, I must confess, I do not. But my great-grandfather was a very organized man who lived a long time. He died at 103. And for his entire adult life, he would write down every single day how much money he earned and how much money he spent and what he did with the excess. And believe it or not, we have those papers. We still have all those papers. And my father did that. And my grandfather did that. And I, out of rebellion, I just said, I can't do this. But it is, however, a good idea to, look at this survey and say, well, how do I fit in here? Where am I in the pack? Am I in the top 20%? Am I in the middle? Or am I down at the bottom? And how are people like me, in terms of income, spending their money? They also do this breakout for you regionally. So they don't do it in fine detail regionally. They just do like South, Northeast, Midwest, and West or something like that. But you can get a sense of regional differences. You can get a sense, they cut this data many different ways, by the age of the head of household, by the gender. You'll see it for yourself. It's a consumer expenditure survey. So that's very good, relatable data that doesn't require any kind of economics training to understand. It just shows you, gives you a sense of if you know your own data, how are you doing versus your other Americans. That's one very useful set. Now, a much more interesting and somewhat more daunting set of information is called the Bureau of Economic Analysis National Income and Product Accounts data, NIPA data. BEA is the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and then NIPA tables. So if you punch that into Google, up will pop. It will seem overwhelming at first, but up will pop tables for the period 1929 to 2016. Now, for the period 1929 to about, I want to say the 1945, the details are less than in the ensuing tables. But you could find there, I think it's quarterly if you want them, but certainly annual information done on a comparable basis that gives you a sense of many, many things, of, how governments spend their money, how wages are broken out by industry, and then by what are called full-time equivalent workers, which is, the government comes up with some way of thinking through for a given industry, how do you normalize? How do you there's some people will be part-time and some will be full-time. How do you, when you count those workers up, how do you turn them into one equivalent unit? And one could debate whether they do it properly, but for the sake of discussion, let's just give the government some credit and say they do it properly. What this data shows underscores what I said earlier on about the course of the economy from 1981 forward. What it shows is from 81 to 99, 1981 to 1999, incomes by industry in the private sector and jobs, full-time equivalents, they soared in that time frame. A lot more money was generated, and people had the ability to save money because their incomes were rising rapidly. Then we had the internet tech bubble in 2000, and the data for 2000 to 2007, let's say, show that incomes in aggregate did not rise at the same rate as they had risen from 1981 to 1999. So the rate of growth slowed, the job growth slowed, and then came 2008. And in 2008, for the first time in a long time, suddenly jobs dropped precipitously, the fastest rate they'd ever dropped in recent history. And, there was a lot of commentary. It tended to be get very partisan in nature about how job growth under Obama in certain periods was faster than in previous periods. Just rubbish. Because you have to look at the long time series. You got to look at, what was the rate of growth in jobs and in income in this important period, 81 to 99, and then afterwards, and then from 2008 forward. The truth is, there was a disaster. You can't blame 2008 on Obama. So there's a disaster in 2008. The job contraction continued in 2009. It eventually found a floor at about 2010, depending on how you look at it. And since then, it has grown, but barely to the level it was back in 2007 and 2007-8, and nowhere near on the same trajectory. So if you go back and you say, if you measure yourself against an ideal and you say, all right, let's say we got really lucky and we continued growing as quickly as we had been growing from 1981 to 1999, how many jobs should we have today? And then compare that to how many we do have. And it's a gap in the tens of millions of jobs.
Well, it also shows, I think, the rate of savings or the ability to save. And what do you know of the amount of money or the capacity of people who are working to set aside money for a rainy day?
Well, it's a sad story. When you go back to that consumer expenditure survey, what it shows is that additions to savings in a given year principally come from the top 20% of all households. That the remaining households either generate very little or actually dipping into whatever savings they may have. So that's in part, I think, because America is very much a consumerist society, and it's going to take a certain amount of re-education and deep thinking to to step away from emulating Kim Kardashian and the crazy high lifestyle of celebrity living, and start thinking about the virtues of being thrifty again. Because we've been on a binge eating, drinking, and spending approach for a long, long time. I mean, I have said that America is in better shape than other countries. Other countries look at us and they say, well, we have worse problems, and we'd be very happy to lend Americans more money so they could buy more cars and things they don't need. And so we're in this strange place where, if we were just governing ourselves and not availing ourselves of foreign money and fancy games, this fake expansion would have become a correction long ago. But we're joined in this effort by other countries who are willing to play along, or who have been willing to play along, and to feed the monster that has become the consumerist approach in this country. So, the data will show you that absent a change in behavior, it's very difficult to save money. But then, experience tells me that if you're determined to save money, you can do it. I mean, it's not like the mass of America is living in abject poverty, bereft of, basic benefits. The kind of poverty that I know you know of, and I certainly know of, having traveled to many, many countries around the world. Yes, there is economic hardship. Yes, there is adversity. But, compared to true economic hardship and adversity that you can find around the world, we're not actually, as a nation, in such desperate shape. It's not as if we can't all afford, myself included, to go on a diet a little bit and spend less money. And, very quickly, when you make tough choices, and I don't particularly mean to pick on Starbucks, but, at my Starbucks, it costs $2.67 for what's the medium-sized coffee, which frankly I don't think is all that good. And let's say you go out every day and you have one cup of coffee at Starbucks. You cut that out, you would have a pile of money at the end of the year. You would have nearly $1,000. You just, instead of putting that money in the Starbucks cash register, you put it in a piggy bank. And the sad reality in this country, if the experts are correct, which they may not be, but there's an article, I think, out recently that an overwhelming majority of Americans does not even have $500 in savings. And
you're listening to Lead Stories on PRN.FM. Our guest is Charles Ortel, and we have just started out on this series that we intend to do to get us ready and prepared to survive a crash that is coming and which in so many ways is already here. If you have questions, 888-874-4888 for Charles Ortel. And it is we getting you conscious of what is about to happen, and in many ways, again, has already begun to happen, giving you an overview, a broad view, and then, of course, we'll get more and more precise and more personal, I guess, to your own circumstances and customize an approach that could help, because it is coming. It really is. And we've been in denial of this for a long time, and we really have to get very conversant with a different, even the language that we use, you have savings, sure, but we have to get a little bit more conversant with how the economy works and doesn't work, and how it would affect us or is affecting us already. So your questions at 888-874-4888. And while we wait for them, I'll continue with Charles. This is the question. And what I liked about what you're doing today is connecting the two. The financial world, the big entity that hovers over us, as against our understanding of our individual situation and to encourage us to see the connection and to become more conversant with that. We have Jay from Queens. You're on the air with Charles Ortel.
Good afternoon, Truth. And good afternoon, Charles. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
I called in. I wanted to formulate a question. There was so much about Charles's discussion about the metrics that he uses to measure direction we're headed in. And I think, while describing the specifics of America's situation in terms of the spending habits and the growth of money and debt deficits, I'd like him to address in more detail the distinction between the GDP as we know it in terms of expense and growth of finance or capital and debt by the rich and corporations as opposed to the debt of the government. Because as I understand it, the government, actually the private debt is much greater than public debt, and we have much to contribute to the way the financial markets have been operating ever since 2004. And I think also relative to America's lifestyle, which obviously is a bit, how should we say, basically living above our means, so are others as we see the growth of the middle class in China and other nations that are following with the growth of their middle class. And that's due largely to, I presume, and from the data tells us, from their wealth in the industry and the transfer of wealth from due to globalization to those other nations. And how, so I would like him to, when he talks about the specifics of America's looking for that word, of lack of savings, to address it in the global context, and that the real side is not just bringing our national debt down, but more or less addressing the private debt sector and its gambling that's been going on. And I hope that's as best I can formulate a question, because I came in 18 minutes later. So please, if you can take that, Charles, and run with it, please do so.
All right. I don't know how much time I have left, but I'll try to answer that one. So on the question of relative comparisons, the best set of data I've found is called UNCTAD, UNCTAD. And that is a data set that goes from 1970 to, I believe it's 2014 or so, by country, by all countries of the world, by year. It provides a breakdown of every single country's economy in terms of the GDP components you're talking about. So household consumption, government consumption, investment, exports, imports. And it shows you hard figures, and it shows you population numbers for that entire period. And what you see is that economies go through different phases. So China's growth today is still primarily driven by massive investments. The scale of the internal consumption market, all household behavior, is actually very small, both because China has about 1.3 billion people and because the absolute number is not that big. Whereas in our case, household consumption is about, it's more than $10 trillion measured on that UNCTAD table, right? So we're the largest, deepest consumer market in the world by far. And that's especially true when you do another statistic, the so-called 80-20 rule. When you look and see whether it's the top 10% or top 20% of all households, how much do they consume versus the balance, and you adjust that to look at the bottom 80 or 90% in China and the U.S. Our consumer market is vast, and actually our scale of investment inside this country is not that big, and there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that we have tremendous excess capacity in the largest market in the world. That you see from the St. Louis Fed data. There's something called a capacity utilization table. We could debate endlessly whether it measures capacity fairly and therefore utilization fairly. But it nonetheless does show that for a long period of time, we've been operating with tremendous excess capacity inside this country. So that's, if I could just, one other thing I just want to jump in with. The final thing is that when I began this journey, I questioned everything. It's kind of how I try to do things when I try to get my arms around a subject. And I started with GDP, and I said, what is this GDP? And I said, do we think it's a good measure? And there's a man who won, I think, a Nobel Prize in economics called Simon Kuznets, who was the person who, in I think it was 1934 or 5, was asked by Franklin Roosevelt to come up with a way to systematize and measure the course of economic progress. So he came up with something called GNP, which gross national product as opposed to gross domestic product, which was then modified to gross domestic product. In the transmittal letter to the Senate that he sent with this long analysis of the economy, he explained the serious defects and biases that are present that lead, in my judgment, to the overestimation of economic activity. There's a lot of double counting that is not removed and should be removed. So I proposed a number of years ago on television, actually, Bloomberg Television, the notion of a different ratio, that you would look to measure every economy. You look at total debt, which is easy to get. In this country, you get it off the Federal Reserve Z1 statistics, which go back consistently to 1945. Look at total debt, compare that to private labor income. That's private sector income plus proprietor's income. You get that from the NIPA tables. And you'll see.
I'm sorry. I thought you had finished your sentence.
No,
well, here's what's happening, Charles. We have an overloaded board, which means people really, really want to talk about how they get themselves together for what's coming and what's already here. So we'll move along, and I'll just ask you whether you would mind coming back tomorrow, because we will not be able to accommodate all the callers today. There are lots of callers.
For you, Yatrice, anything.
Hey, you have a couple mil hanging around?
Except that.
Well, thank you so much. Well, let's go to Randolph in Montreal. What's your question? Just if you can get to the question right away.
Yes, hello?
Yes.
Hello, Yatrice. I just wanted to ask Charles.
Go ask him directly. He's right here.
Okay. Charles, you were talking about, say, purchases at a coffee shop. And but what happens to the people who are no longer working versus military expenditures of, say, a tow missile, which is something like $1 million? At least the people who put in this $2.67, the money goes around, whereas the tow missile, once it's used, it's history. Money doesn't go around. So isn't the problem not that we're really are interdependent? The problem is the military expenditures are totally wasteful and unproductive sector of the economy. And I know that people argue exports into
your question.
Okay, so what about this situation where the money doesn't go around in the military situation, whereas cutting off your expenditures into the daily economy really destroys the employment possibilities of people?
Thank you.
I'll try to answer quickly. So you really asked two separate questions, but let's address the Starbucks question first, the multiplier question. There I was really just focused upon how could somebody with no savings quickly acquire savings by changing behavior. That's what I was focused on. I take the point about multiplier effects and the globalist structure, the idea that we should now make cars by making parts here and shipping them to China and then shipping them back, has changed the multiplier effect across the broader economy. It's worsened it. It's one of the reasons why economic growth inside Canada, if you're calling from Canada and the United States, is not what it once was, because we are engaged in this practice of not doing every step in the manufacturing process inside our own country. So that's one. Now, on the question military spending, there I talked earlier about DEA NIPA table data, and there you can see quite clearly that actually, though the United States spends a tremendous amount on our military, more than any other country proportionally in the world. Our rate of spending is far under what it was, in the 60s, when Kennedy was president. You go look at the composition of government spending in the United States and look at military versus non-military government spending. Non-military government spending in the United States is mushrooming, exploding. And in actual fact, yes, our military spending is high, but it is much lower than it used to be in relative terms. And finally, on the question of the multiplier effect, I can't speak to the benefit or demerits of the TOW missile, but it was made by somebody somewhere in a factory. And those factories had workers. And when you look at the defense contractors, they don't actually make that much money. They employ a lot of people. They're not generating profits. And there is a certain multiplier effect there. So I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you. David from Brooklyn, you'll be the last questioner today. I just advise, please be patient. Tomorrow we will get to those who were not able to have their questions posed and answered today. The whole idea really is to be of service to you and to make the time to talk about the subject, because it will be very, very important to us all as, the future comes close to us, closer and closer, and it ain't looking all that good. David from Brooklyn, you're on the air. I'm
going to make it laser. The question I want to ask you, Mr. Ortel, when you look at this economy, would you think it to be correct to say this economy is designed to benefit those at the very top, the oligarchs, the capitalists and whatnot, and essentially not the people? Is that how you look at it? And if you have time, I want you to explain to us about the stock market being somewhat of a casino, and how does that relate also to index funds rather than just picking out funds in the stock area? Would you comment on those things?
I'll try to. Those are big topics, and I'll try to tackle portions of them quickly. Clearly, those who start out with advantages in any society can exploit those advantages, and if they start out with a lot more wealth than the mass of the population, it is likely that they're going to do better. The distribution of wealth around the world has never been even, ever in history, in recorded history, and it never will be. So what we should care about is whether there's opportunity, whether it's possible to start with nothing in this country and end up with something. And I think it was a lot of something. I think there are many examples of that. There are also many examples of corruption that have not been exposed and punished properly. I am not generally one who favors a lot of regulation, but in the area of regulating the stock market, the capital markets and charities, I think or if you're listening to the show, I go on it, I think that I'm very much in favor of regulating those things. So there are lots of things we could tweak and improve in this economy. I have on my website a 10-point plan. You could disagree with it. Prove it, please. But I think as imperfect as humans are everywhere, there's on balance far more good inside this country than evil, far more to be proud of than to be ashamed of. And, so I do think we need more regulation. On index versus individual stocks and bonds, I think the digital age has far exceeded the progress of regulators in regulating the stock market, and therefore I think there's been a massive bubble inflated in markets that will need to be corrected. And I think we need 21st century regulation, and we certainly don't have it.
Well, very good timing because we're out of time. Thank you so much for your calls. We will continue tomorrow because we have quite a few people who didn't get their questions in, and more, I'm sure, who will like to call and ask questions. But this has been a very good way to start to get us into the mindset of taking direct responsibility for getting ourselves ready. And being ready, whatever the future is, but to be more ready than we have been to cope with possible adversity. Thanks so much, Charles, for being with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Stay tuned. Coming up next, Meditations and Molotovs with Vincent Emanuele. You can reach me at leadstories, L-E-I-D, stories@gmail.com. A pleasure always and a great privilege to be in your company. We see you tomorrow. Make sure you tune in. Bye-bye.